Welcome to Community Christian. My name is Ed Martin, and we are so glad you are here for this series, Imagine Heaven. You know, I have been looking forward to teaching what we're going to teach in this series for quite some time, about as excited as I have been about teaching anything in quite some time. The whole start of this series began more than a year ago, and I saw a book with this title, Imagine Heaven, written by a guy that I somewhat knew. And when I say that, I mean he's a guy that we have a lot of mutual friends. We have been in similar circles. I don't want to say we're friends, but I know who he is. And he's a guy that started a church in Austin, Texas. His name is John Burke, and it's a church a lot like Community Christian, probably a lot more polished than Community Christian. In fact, we stole the phrase "no perfect people" from them. Now, I don't want to say we stole we can't even spell perfect from them. John is a very bright guy. He had studied engineering at the University of Texas and practiced engineering for a while. He's, you got to prove it to me, kind of skeptical guy. He can do research. So I'm confident spelling is not a problem for John like it is for me. But because I knew who he was and I knew his background and I knew that he was a kind of skeptical guy, when I saw the topic of this book, I was fascinated. And so I grabbed it. And just so you know, I have now read this book through a couple of times. Parts of it I've read many, many times over. I've recommended it to many people. It was on the New York Times bestsellers list for a while. It was on the Amazon charts for many, many weeks. And it's really not a surprise. Why? Because of the topic level. I mean, everybody in our culture wonders about what happens when you die. I mean, is there a God? Does heaven have a plan for me? What's going to happen after we die? And you know, even though we're sort of fascinated with this, and you don't have to look too far to see in songs and books and movies and TV channels of things talks about spirits and near-death experiences and what happens after we die. It's just everywhere. We have this fascination with it, but we also sort of live in denial about it. And what I mean by that is nobody really wants to talk about death. We want to hear about what might happen, but we don't really want to focus on the fact that we're going to die, which is really odd because there's a 100% chance you're going to die. We're all checking out the same way around here, but we don't like to talk about that. We're a lot like the guy who asked his two best friends, "Hey, what do you want people to say about you when you die?" And one guy said, "Well, I'm hoping they'll say I was a great doctor and that I helped lots of people." His other friend said, "I'm hoping my kids will say I was a great dad." And the guy who asked the question said, I'm hoping they'll say, "Look, he's moving." Well, believe it or not, more and more these days, people are saying, "Look, he's moving." Research tells us that more than 13 million Americans have had near-death experiences. And because of the advances in medical research, more people have been clinically, physically dead. I mean, no brain activity, and then brought back to life than at any time in history. And what they tell us that they have experienced, it's fascinating. And in fact, it's hard for some to believe. In fact, I found almost all of these stories impossible to believe and just didn't listen to the testimony outright until just the last few years. But I believe if you're willing to open your mind to it and you're willing to consider this, if you actually listen to it, what you hear is that they are telling us what the Bible has been telling us for thousands of years. Well, that's what we're going to look at over the next few weeks together in this series, Imagine Heaven. We're, of course, going to look at what the Bible has to say about this. I mean, you came to a church, so we're going to talk about what the Bible has to say about that. But along with that, you're going to hear some testimonies from very credible people from professions who they really don't have any reason to die. To lie. You're going to hear from doctors, and you're going to hear from skeptical scientists. You're going to hear from airline pilots, people who in their industry really could be ridiculed for even believing in this kind of thing. But you're going to hear interviews where they talk about the experiences you have. You're not going to want to miss any of those. Along with that, we're going to look at what John Burke and all the research that he did in his book. And this book does not read like a normal Christian book. And by that I mean there are loads of footnotes for this book. It reads more like a textbook at times. Almost 35 years ago, John was a student at the University of Texas, and his father lay dying of cancer, and he went back home to see his father, and when he got in the room, his dad was asleep, but he noticed next to his dad's bed there was a book called Life After Death, and in that book was the phrase near-death experience. In fact, that was the very first book to coin that phrase. Well, while his dad slept, John took the book, went out into the living room, and he began to read, and that night he read that book cover to cover. When he was done with it, the things that were talked about in the book were so fascinating to him and so intriguing to him. They raised so many questions like, is there really life to death? Could all this stuff, I mean, at this time, he wasn't a Christian. He didn't believe in God. He certainly didn't believe the Bible. And he began to wonder, is there something to this thing with God? All these questions about life after death. Well, when he went back to the University of Texas, he joined a Bible study there, and he began to ask his questions. And people began to give him evidence, and he began to realize that the Bible was based on factual kind of stuff, the kind of things that we've talked about here in other kind of series, and he became a follower of Christ. Well, after getting his degree and practicing in the engineering field for a little bit, John began to feel like he had been called to go back to Austin and start a church, the church that I told you about there in Austin, Texas. And he maintained this as sort of a hobby of studying these near-death experiences. Over the last several years, John's authored a few books. In fact, he had a contract with a publisher to write one final book, and he really didn't have a book he wanted to write. And so he told the publisher he didn't really have one to write, and the publisher said, there must be something you haven't ever written about. And John said, well, I do have this sort of hobby where for the last 20 years I've been reading thousands of near-death experiences, and I wonder if anybody would be interested in that. And in this book, Imagine Heaven, John includes some of the research that people have been doing who've studied thousands of near-death experiences, and do they give us a glimpse of what the Bible says has been true about heaven all along? And I'll tell you, when you listen to them, they can really begin to help us imagine heaven and what it's going to be like. And imagining what it's going to be like can begin to help not only change our eternities, but it can change how we live here and now. If you're a little bit skeptical, I get that. In fact, we're so glad you decided to come. And you should know, we started this whole church for people just like you. And this is a place where you can belong here, you can come here, you can fit in here, and you don't even have to believe what we believe. And we get that you might be skeptical about this. Again, I'll say to you, I was skeptical about these kind of things until just recently. But here's what I'm hoping. I hope you will consider coming for every one of this series for the next 6 weeks, and I think you're going to hear some fascinating testimony about what you can find out that heaven is a very real place. And if you're here and you're a follower of Christ, what I hope is going to happen to you is that you will realize how real a place heaven is. I mean, the truth is, for most of us, even those of us who are Christ followers, for most of us, our ideas about heaven are a little whimsical. They're sort of mystical. They're more based on rumor and jokes than they really are on anything solid. In fact, most people I know who think they're going to go to heaven when they die, they have a firmer view of what their next vacation is going to look like than they do what heaven is going to be like. Well, what I'm hoping is, as we imagine heaven together and we listen to the testimony of what the Bible says and what near-death experiences tell us, that you will begin to have a firmer view of what heaven is, and I think you're going to be amazed at how practical this series can be. So today what I want to do is I want to kick off this series by introducing what we're going to talk about over the next 5 weeks. And let me just say, I'm skeptical of stories, and one of the things that's happened to me over the whole time I've been in ministry for 30 years now is people have told me these kind of stories. And honestly, I'm the kind of guy that when they tell me, I would smile and I would go, And when they were done, I just doubted the whole thing because people have a tendency to say some pretty bizarre things. And so I get it if you're skeptical. I have been skeptical too. But here's what I found, is even if one story is a little bizarre and the things people say don't make a lot of sense, I don't have to totally buy into their experiences, because what they have been telling me when you listen to it is they've been telling me what the Bible has been saying all along. I mean, if they were conflicting in some way, well, then we would have a real problem going on there, but they aren't. They're confirming what the Bible has to say. And I've come to realize that maybe the reason that people are having a hard time and some of the experiences they describe are bizarre is because this is human beings trying to describe something that was very emotional for them, very difficult for them, and some of it was beyond anything that they are capable of it describing. And that's why I just want to say to you why it's dangerous to take just one story or just a few stories and build a whole idea of what the afterlife is going to be built on by that. Instead, what John does in this book, Imagine Heaven, is they've taken thousands of these stories and they've come up what are the common elements in all of these stories across culture, across background of people who believe in God, people who don't believe in God. What are the common elements? And when you see what those common elements are, it confirms what the Bible has been saying in a fairly compelling kind of way. John includes 120 of these stories in the book Imagine Heaven. And I hope you'll join in with us for the series, and I hope you'll get involved in a small group. If you haven't already decided to, you should go to Group Link tonight. We're going to be talking about these in groups, and we'd love to have you in that. So, imagine for a second that what you have been dreading your whole life finally takes place, and you breathe your last breath. Well, what happens at that moment is not what you expect. In fact, what people report who have experienced that moment and come back to life tell us is that instead of being terrifying, it was exhilarating. Instead of being dead at that moment and being afraid of what was going to happen, in that moment they tell us that they go outside of their body and they are in a brand new body. That often they see themselves and they're no longer in the body they knew as their body, but they know it's them and they're in a new body. In fact, many of them describe the fact that they had a hard time believing that they were actually dead at first because they felt more alive than they had ever felt. What they had expected to be terrifying, instead, had become a life-giving, invigorating kind of experience. That's what people began to tell skeptical doctors and oncologists and other scientists who helped them revive from these experiences. And when they began to hear this testimony, it's those kind of things that began to convince them, many skeptical doctors, that there was, in fact, life after death. I want you to listen to how cardiologist Dr. Michael Sabone describes what changed his mind. Before talking with Pete and scores like him, I didn't believe there was such a thing as near-death experience. Pete told me that he left his body during his first cardiac arrest and he watched his resuscitation. When I asked him to tell me what exactly he saw, he described the resuscitation with such detail and accuracy that I could have later used the tape to teach physicians. Sabone says, these people like Pete Morton saw details of their resuscitation that they could not have otherwise seen. One patient noticed that the physician had failed to wear scuffs on his shoes, over his white patent leather shoes during an open heart surgery. In many cases, I was able to confirm the patient's testimony with medical records from the hospital staff. Dr. Sabone studied many of these near-death experiences, and his plan had been to refute them. He says, I wanted to see, could these experiences pass scientific muster? And they did. He found that they did pass scientific tests, and his years of research led to him finally publishing a book called Reflections of Death, and later he published the same thing for the Journal of the American Medical Association. Well, radiation oncologist Dr. Jeffrey Long read the findings in the AMA journal, and he was so shocked that it would be included there, and he doubted it so much that he couldn't imagine how a doctor could believe it. That is, until one night he was at dinner, and a friend of his named Sheila told him about having an experience where she had coded. And what she meant was that's a time, when her heart had stopped. Well, Dr. Long decided at that point that he would press in a little bit and he would take a little chance, and he asked her, did anything happen to you when you coded? Hesitantly, Sheila said, yes, I found myself at ceiling level. I could see the EKG machine I was hooked to. The EKG was flatlined. The doctors and nurses were frantically trying to bring me back to life. The scene below me was a near panic situation. In contrast to the chaos below, I felt a profound sense of peace. I was completely free of any pain. My consciousness drifted out of the operating room and moved into a nursing station. I immediately recognized this as the nursing station on the floor where I had been prior to my surgery. From my vantage point near the ceiling, I saw the nurses bustling about, performing their daily duties. After I watched the nurses for a while, a tunnel opened. I was drawn to the tunnel. I then passed through the tunnel and became aware of a bright light at the end of the tunnel. I felt peaceful. As I passed through the tunnel, I found myself in an area of beautiful, mystical light. In front of me were several of my beloved relatives who had previously died. It was a joyous reunion. We embraced. I found myself with a mystical being of overwhelming love and compassion. "Do you want to go back?" he asked. I responded, "I don't know," which was just like my old indecisive self. After further discussion, I knew the choice to return to my physical body was mine. It was the most difficult decision I had made. I was in a realm of overwhelming love. In this realm, I knew I was truly home. Finally, I returned to my body. I woke in the ICU after a day later. I had tubes and wires all over me. I could not talk about my profound experience. Since that time, Dr. Long has collected and scientifically again studied thousands of these accounts from around the world from different cultures, some of which are included in the book Imagine Heaven, and he concludes, by studying thousands of detailed accounts of NDEers, I found evidence that led to this astonishing conclusion. NDEs provide such powerful scientific evidence that it is reasonable to accept the existence of an afterlife. When you die, you leave this body behind, but you are still fully you in a brand new spiritual body. Well, that's what the Bible has been telling us for thousands of years. You may not know this, but Paul, one of the earliest followers of Jesus, had been originally an opponent of Christianity. In fact, he tried to stomp out Christianity, thinking he was doing God a favor. And he met on a road a man of brilliant light, which many NDEers experience, and he realized was Jesus. And he was blinded. The light was so bright he was blinded by it. He becomes a Christian, and over the next couple of decades, Paul goes around the whole Mediterranean basin planting churches. At one point in a city called Lystra, he's stoned. Now, I don't mean stoned like, you know what I mean. He literally, let me just read it to you. They stoned Paul and dragged him out of town, thinking he was dead. But as the believers gathered around him, he got up and went back into town. Now, many people believe Paul has, in this moment, a near-death experience, because look at what Paul writes in the Bible. I was caught up in the third heaven. Whether I was in the body or out of the body, I don't know. Only God knows. But I do know that I was caught up to paradise and heard things so astounding that they cannot be expressed in words, things no human is allowed to tell. It's the same Paul that in a letter to this same church in Corinth explains that when we die, we get brand new bodies. It's like we get an upgrade. It's you 2.0. Our bodies are buried in brokenness, but they're raised in glory. They're buried in weakness, but they're raised in strength. They're buried as natural bodies, but they'll be raised as spiritual bodies. And we're going to talk about that, about our new bodies next week. But we'll still be ourselves. In fact, one of the most moving parts of this book to me was that many people with near-death experiences say the very first person you meet in heaven is you. You realize who you really are, your new self in your new body. People consistently say that in heaven they felt more alive than ever. In fact, but that's not the way we normally imagine heaven. For most of us, when we imagine heaven, heaven is almost less real when you hear people talk about it. It's like less tangible than this world. It's kind of fuzzy. It's kind of ethereal. It's kind of cloudy. It's the kind of thing nobody really thinks about. I remember a Far Side cartoon from years ago. Maybe you saw it, where a guy's sitting on the cloud and he's just sort of bored and he says, I wish I'd brought a magazine. Well, that's the way people tend to think about it. We have these horrible views of heaven, like I got to sit on a cloud, and I got to wear a robe, and I got to play a harp, and I got to do that for millions of years. I mean, other people picture it like a long church service. I mean, I'm a professional church guy, and I don't want that. The truth is that this life is boring, and it gets long, and it's frustrating because it's not what we were created for. This world is more like the birth canal that we have to go through to get to the real world. This world is just a shadow of the world that's to come. So imagine the day when you leave this earth and suddenly you find yourself not just with 5 senses, but you have vision like you can never imagine, and you have hearing, and you have other senses where you can know the thoughts of the people around you. And you can see things, and they're more alive than you've ever imagined. And you know what's amazing is that people who've gone through these experiences, even people who were born blind, they report the same things that the Bible's been saying all along. People who were born blind in this world, when they have near-death experiences, they see the exact same things. In fact, Vicky, who was born blind at birth, flatlined after a bad car accident. She had a hard time adjusting when she started her near-death experience just to the whole experience of visual perception. She talked about looking down, and she sees doctors working on what must be a body, and she says, "Finally, I recognized my wedding ring and my hair." She had waist-long hair, and she had known that her wedding ring had like orange blossoms on it, and people had described it to her. She identified both, and she thought, is that my body down there? Am I dead or what? They were trying frantically to work on this thing that I discovered was my body, and I felt very detached from it, and I thought, I'm out of here. I can't get any of these people to listen to me. As soon as I thought that, I went through the ceiling as if it was nothing, and it was wonderful to be out of there and to be free, not worrying about bumping into anything. I knew where I was going for the first time in my life, and I heard this sound of wind chimes that was the most incredible sound that I can describe. Vicky noticed that she was fully herself, but she had a distinct form. It was not an indistinct form, but it wasn't a physical body. She said she was made of light. Trees and flowers and vast numbers of people surrounded her in this place of tremendous light. And the light, Vicky said, was something not just that you saw, but you felt. You could experience the light. And the people were bright. Everybody there was made of light. And I was made of light. What the light conveyed was love. There was love everywhere. It's like love came from the grass, and love came from the birds, and love came from the trees. It was incredible, really beautiful. And I was overwhelmed by the experience because I really couldn't imagine what light was like. It's still a very emotional thing to me when I talk about it. What's amazing is Vicky and other people born blind describe light coming out of things instead of shining through things. It's what the Bible teaches. But how would a blind person know that? And how would blind people who weren't even born in cultures where the Bible was taught know that? But of course, followers know that Jesus said, I'm the light of the world. I had always thought that was a metaphor, but maybe it's more, because John, who writes the book of Revelation, he says, heaven, the city, has no need of sun or moon, for the glory of God illuminates the city, and the Lamb, Jesus, is the light. The nations will walk in light. Vicky and others describe this light as its life and its love and vibrant colors and indescribable music and trees and grass that are alive, and you can experience them in time and travel on a whole nother dimension. Harvard neurosurgeon Eben Alexander, because he was a neurosurgeon, he knew that when the brain dies, everything's done. Everything's ended at that point. Consciousness ends when the brain dies. And then his brain crashed. And he found himself in a whole other place. First, in a horrible place. And then he got to glimpse a place of untold beauty and said, in the worlds above this one, time simply doesn't behave as it does here. A moment can seem like a lifetime, And one of several lifetimes can seem like a moment. Well, that's exactly what the Bible says when Peter wrote, with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like a day. But if that seems weird or scary to you, it's not. In fact, what people say is, it feels like home. It feels like where you belong. It's what they've been looking for, and where you're never alone. See, heaven was meant ultimately for relationship. And those who get a glimpse of heaven agree on one thing more than anything else they agree on in all of the research, that love is the point of it all. To love God and to love people is what the prophets and what Jesus have been telling us about all along. So if love and relationships is the goal of the whole thing, why would we think that in the next life God would end and tear us apart from relationships? Heaven is meant for relationships. Nothing could be further from the truth that we would be removed from it. Marv Besterman, a bank president who died in a hospital, recalls a welcoming party consisting of close relatives and those who had spiritually influenced him and those who he had spiritually influenced. He says, both of my friends were prayer warriors, and we'd spent many hours praying together. I'm not sure if this is why God chose those two guys for me to see. They were significant to me in some way. A woman who died giving birth said, I recognized my grandmother and a girl I'd known when I was in school and many other relatives and friends. It was a very happy occasion, and I felt that they had come to protect and to guide me. It's almost as if I was coming home. They were there to greet me and to welcome me. A word of warning, I'll just say again. Don't take one person's experience or a few persons' experience and develop your whole view of the afterlife after it. You have to remember, people are getting just one little glimpse of a much bigger picture that God is revealing to us all throughout Scripture. Just because people see one little peek doesn't mean they've seen the whole thing. And we're going to see in weeks to come that not everybody that welcomes us means us well. There is a darker side of this, and we're going to talk about that as well. It's like people who have these, they just see one little glimpse of something. Like, for instance, everybody knows what Mount Rushmore looks like, right? I mean, it looks like this. But did you know there's another side to Mount Rushmore, and it looks like this? See, you have to see the whole picture. You have to see the whole thing. God intended for the whole deal to be about relationships, and that our relationships would last, and that they would go to new depths and new levels, and that would go on for eternity. He created us for relationship, first with Himself, which is why all the NDEers have this, not all of them, but many, many, many of them have this experience of both young and old meeting this man of brilliant light, many of which know it to be Jesus, but those who don't know that He is God, and people who don't even have that form of a God or a Savior in their religion, they know that He's different than what their religion had taught them. Dr. George Ritchie, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, died of pneumonia. He has a death certificate to prove that he died of pneumonia. And he didn't realize he was dead looking down at his body. And then a light came into the room. It was impossibly bright. It was like a million welder's lamps. I thought, I'm glad I don't have physical eyes at this moment. This light would destroy the retina in 1/10 of a second. No, I corrected myself, not light. He would be too bright to look at. For now I saw that this was not a light, but it was a man who had entered the room. Or rather, a man made out of light entered the room. He knew it was Jesus, who he had learned about in Sunday school, and he'd been taught, who was meek and mild and gentle, kind of a weakling. But this person was not that. He was power itself, power infused, power fused together with unconditional love, this overwhelming love, this astonishing love, love beyond my wildest imagining. This love knew every unlovable thing about me, the quarrels with my stepmother, my explosive temper, the sex thoughts that I could never control, every mean, selfish thought and action since the day I was born, and accepted and loved me just the same. When I say He knew everything about me, this was simply an observable fact. For into that room, along with his radiant presence, simultaneously also entered every single episode of my entire life. Everything that ever happened to me was simply there in full view, all seemingly to take place at the same moment. How is that possible? I don't have any way of knowing. Transfixed, I stared at myself, standing at the blackboard in third grade, receiving my Eagle badge, wheeling Papa Dabney onto the veranda. Hundreds, thousands of scenes, all illuminated by the searing light in existence where time seemed to have ceased. What's amazing is how consistent people with near-death experience say this life review is. This life review in the presence of a man of light who is fused together with the most amazing, unconditional love. He knows absolutely everything, every thought, every motive, every deed, and yet has unconditional love. But then for followers of Christ, what else would we expect? The Bible tells us that God is love. Jesus said, "There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known." The scripture goes on to say, "Therefore, judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait until the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in darkness and will expose the motives of the heart. At that time, each will receive their praise from God." We're going to look more at this life review in the weeks to come. But one thing I want you to note, did you notice that the goal of it is that everyone would receive praise from God? That God wants to reward you? That God who loves you and knows you wants to reward you? There's one thing for sure, and one thing I want to make sure you hear is that you are here on purpose. You were designed by purpose. You have a purpose. And if you wind up thinking that you don't, you just need to come and be part of this. You were designed on purpose. God made you for a purpose. And you can make a difference. It's not too late for any of us. That's what is amazing, and we'll see it. God is a God of compassion and mercy and grace. He's the God of the second and the third and the fourth chance. He's the God that no one has ever loved you more than He loves you. But I don't want you to just take my word on it. I want you to see the verse to interview that we have with you. This is done by John Burke with a very skeptical doctor named Mary Neal. And I'll just warn you, the audio on this recording that they have is not very good, but what she has to say is so important. Mary and her husband had gone on an anniversary trip, and she loved kayaking, and they're kayaking in South America when her kayak gets trapped under a waterfall, and she's dead. Let's watch this together.
So take us back to that day. I mean, here you are, pinned under a waterfall. You realize you can't get loose. I mean, that must have been terrifying.
One would think so, but I felt great. I had always feared a drowning death, but actually I felt no fear. I felt no panic. I felt no sense of air hunger. I felt wonderful. And the moment that I very consciously made a choice to surrender the outcome, I truly asked that God's will be done, regardless of whether that meant I was to live or die. The very moment that I asked that, I was overcome with a very physical sensation of being held and comforted and reassured by Christ that everything was fine. My husband would be fine, my young children would be fine regardless. And I was this receptacle into which Christ was pouring His love and His very being. And that was the first of many profound aspects of this experience, because I was no saint. I tried to be a good person, but I did not deserve to be held or loved by Christ. Just like, none of us ever deserve anything. And while I was being held, my life, as you said earlier, was just laid bare for all of the high points and low points. And
so it was like a life review?
We started a life review, and it was
Is it
not
like you re-experience your life, or what? I know we're going to go into
It's difficult. It's all simultaneously occurring, and everything is present at the same time, and not with any sense of judgment, which is what I would have assumed would have happened. But we then at one point went through my life and looked at all of the events that I would have otherwise said were terrible or bad or horrible or sad or tragic. And I had the most remarkable experience of seeing that event, not 3 or 4 or 5 times removed, but seeing how a given event impacted me, impacted my little world and the world as a whole, when seen from a vantage point of 25, 30, 35 times removed. And what I was shown again and again and again and again is that God's promise is true, that indeed beauty comes from all things, even when we can't see it.
He works all things together for the good.
Absolutely.
So you experienced this life review. You were underwater like 15 minutes or something, and then
Yes.
when you came up and they found you, they started their stopwatch, and it was another 15.
Right.
So where were you, and what were you doing?
I was gone. I was still aware of the physicality of it all. I could feel the water. I could feel the plastic of the boat. My body was sucked over the deck of the boat by the current. And as my body was coming out of the boat, my spirit peeled away from my body. And eventually I then rose up and out of the river, and I was greeted by a group of somethings. People, spirits, beings, all those words seem sort of hokey to me, but
They had
these were
bodies. They were what? What was it
they
like?
did have physical form. They had head, arms, legs. They were wearing these robes that were very indistinct, somewhat translucent or pearlescent, and were radiant, absolutely more brilliant than the sun, but not in a blinding sense. And they were absolutely exploding with beauty and an absolutely pure, unconditional love of God. And it's a love that we don't experience. We experience conditional love. But this was an absolute love. And they were so overjoyed to greet me and welcome me and love me and guide me. And there was a shift of time and dimension so that I could be with them. And I was trying very desperately to get down this exceptionally beautiful path to this great dome structure of sorts that I knew without any doubt was the point of no return.
So that was like the entrance to
It
heaven.
was, I feel like I was in heaven, but I was definitely in the foyer. And this was the point at which there was no return. And I could simultaneously look back at the river and see the guys pull my body to shore and see them start CPR. And I was really surprised at that point because I recognized my body as mine, as representing my life, my husband, my children. And I had a great life. I have a great life. I had every reason in the world to return. But I looked at my body and I knew I was not coming back. I
didn't
knew
want to.
that I had absolutely no intention to return because I was absolutely overcome with this sensation or this experience of being home, of being where I really belong, where we all really belong. It was as though I'd been on this long and wonderful journey to earth, but now I was home. I was going to sleep in my own bed. It was wonderful. And so I kept going down this path as quickly as I could. And
And there was beauty
the
along.
beauty spoke to me. I absolutely believe that God presents to each one of us, just like on earth. God meets us where we are. And I believe that God presents to each one of us that experience, that scene that will speak to us and that we can understand, that will make us feel comfortable and loved and welcomed. And for me, it was color and flowers and the aroma of flowers, because that's what really moves my soul. And
Were they like real? I mean, when you,
It was-
people kind of still, we think it's kind of probably fuzzy.
no, it was
and-
real. But it was different, because here on earth, we feel this table and it's real. But we can't understand the table. We can't hear the table. We can't feel the love of the table. We can't experience the table. But there, the flowers, the aromas, the colors were faceted. I could understand them.
It's like you experience it in
I
a whole new
experienced
way.
in a
Life.
very different way.
Yeah.
And we then reached this threshold, and I was there for what felt like many, many hours. And while I was there, I had many profound parts of this experience, but one of which was this sense of understanding, of getting it. understanding the divine order of everything. And one of the things that was so important to me is coming to an understanding of how it can really be true that there is a God who is real and present, and that there's a God who actually knows each and every one of us, all billions of us on the planet, loves each and every one of us as though we're the only ones, and has a plan for each and every one of our lives that's one of hope. And for me, that was life-changing. Yeah. And it should be life-changing.
Yeah.
And then I got kicked out. It was traumatic.
What did they say?
I was told that it wasn't my time. I still had more work to do on earth, and that I had to go back to I did what I think any reasonable person would do, and I said, I'm good. I was told everything was fine. I can stay. And as I said earlier, I'm a doctor, not a lawyer, so here I am.
Isn't that amazing? You know, one of the things that is clear in all of these videos you're going to see, these testimonies, is that everyone wants to stay. That's because heaven's better than you could ever imagine. And if you're skeptical and you're here, I hope you'll at least come back and you'll hear the evidence, because there is a God who loves you, and a God who has something way better in store for you. I'm going to ask that people who are going to help us serve communion, if you'd go ahead, and only you, if you would just go ahead and stand up right now and go get ready to serve us communion. You know, while they're going, this whole thing made me think about when I was a little kid. I grew up in a very Southern culture, very Southern family, big Southern family. We'd have these Southern meals, you know, where everybody's in the house and there's 2 or 3 meats on the table. There's all kinds of vegetables, and the food is so incredibly good. And you just have this great experience. You eat till you're just about to bust, and then when it's all done, some of the ladies would get up and they'd start clearing the table. And if we were at my house, at the house I grew up in, my mom would inevitably she'd say, hey, everybody, keep your fork. Oh my, I loved hearing my mom say, keep your fork, because I knew when she said, keep your fork, that we were having dessert. And dessert my mom made, it was unbelievable. It was the best that we'd had all day. Well, studying for this series, in fact, this whole thing of reading about heaven and imagining heaven, it's convinced me again that we need to keep our fork, because the best is yet to come. You know, every week when we come together at Community Christian, we take communion because the night that Jesus was last with his disciples, he started this meal where he said, hey, every time, I'm about to go away, and every time you guys are together, I want you to take this meal, and I want you to remember me. And then he said to them, and one day, I'm going to eat this meal together with you in the kingdom. He was saying to them, the best is yet to come. So when we come together and we partake, and we take the juice and the cup, that's what we remember. Now, if you're here and you're not yet a follower of Christ, I get this is all weird to you, and you can just let all of this pass. We're going to sing today while we partake, and we're going to sing a song about the one thing that remains in heaven. It's the unconditional love of God. And so you can just listen to the song. You can look at the words. You can ask God if it's all true. We believe that he'll speak and move, and we hope you'll sense that he is real. But right now, let's sing together, and let's partake together.